Al, thank you so much for joining me on the International Classroom podcast. I was doing a little bit of research, obviously, in preparation for this. And one thing, I didn't know this, but looking at your past history, where you first started out, it told me you started off in things like within finance and sort of marketing and management of those types of things. Like, how did you transition then from that sort of field into where you see you today?
It's quite a journey, actually. Yeah, I mean, I started out with Barclays Bank and Unilever working in finance. I know it doesn't look it, but it was back in the 80s. And during that time, IT went from being something that was a huge room at the side of a building, these big servers, into the advent of desktop computing. That interests me more. So I broke away from the big company roles and was consulting, doing people's accounts and finance, whilst at the same time setting up their computer systems. I then met somebody who'd been working on a remote tool for managing devices when people were hundreds of miles away. And we said, you know what, if we did that, rather than 1-to-1, but 1-to-30, we could actually support devices within the classroom. And my passion was always, I guess as a dad, was about what opportunities were there for our children and young learners. I set up a business in America, so I flew over and lived in Atlanta for 3 years with the children, spent my Monday morning at Delta Airlines hub, flying out, working in school districts all week and coming home at the end, and then wanted to come back to the UK as my children were at an age to join the education system. And the first thing I did was, okay, I'm going to join a governing body and we're going to bid to build a school in this area, and we're going to bid for another school, and then this school hasn't got funds, we'll bid for another one. And before long, if you spend enough time with eyes and ears listening and getting involved in education, what you try to do is find ways to co-produce and find ways to mitigate problems. And if you have as it ended up, the lovely position of spending most of my time working in the edu space, but having amazing folks where I can go and say, you know what, I've got this great idea that I've heard. Can we go make something that will mitigate it? Or can we collaborate on something? I found that's a really, really, for me, a really exciting fusion.
I also saw, obviously you mentioned helping fund schools there. Was there some part in helping establish a university as well?
Yeah, I'm a man of quite a few hats because I'm not very good at saying no, and I'm very much a believer you've got to roll your sleeves up. So I chaired the Employment and Skills Board for our region, then was chair of the Business Board and sit on the Combined Mayoral Authority for Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, very much a heart of academic excellence across the region. When we say Cambridge, Peterborough, a little bit of a cold spot. So I was involved in the bids and funding to secure for the first phase of building the new university in Peterborough that's operated by Angela Ruskin, and then worked again with funding with the team for a second and third phase. So that's about 70-80 million gone into it so far. And the big measure of success for me is that nearly half the students that go to that university live in the local area and probably wouldn't have gone to university. That wouldn't have been a pathway had they not considered it. And it's a university that does everything from midwifery and social care through to degrees in computer game design, technology, business, accounting, and again, a good slice of those students are degree apprentices, so learning on the job, making the next step of education accessible for all. So for me, it's kind of like win-win. I'll write that on my tombstone along with a few other things.
And obviously for anyone who wasn't aware, then I think that's a real depth and breadth as to probably just a touch of the reasons why you were awarded the MBE recently. Hopefully we're hoping for a knighthood soon, aren't we, as well?
Well, I'm quite happy with my MBE. I'm not going to turn another one down, but I think I've had my little day in the spotlight and my recognition, so I'm more than happy.
Well, I think it's when we talk about education and we talk about legacy and we talk about often teachers go into a classroom, we influence 30 people, and then we go into leadership, we might influence 100 people. But I think there's going to be thousands of people across the world who will have been affected in a positive way and touched by you. So that introduction, I think, sets us up wonderfully for what we want to talk to you about today. And so I always like to start off with probably the difficult question. I want to start off with what I call swallow the frog. And I want to cut through the policies and the frameworks. So I want to dive into the devil's advocate one. But if a school wanted to weaponize AI in the most subtle way, in a compliant looking way, like, what would that look like to you? And how would we even know if it was happening?
Imagine the concept that anyone would try and weaponize AI. I mean, I can't imagine there are any technology organizations that think like that. I suppose I might try and distill it down into a few grown-up kind of sentences. I suppose the first one is they would probably try and rebrand control as efficiency and automate decisions where there's weak human oversight. That's generally where technology tends to move further in the direction than we would want it to, because we're kind of presented with the option that this is a better way of you working smarter and harder, but actually you lose grip and control. The second part, I suppose, is if you wanted to weaponize AI like anything else, hot topic, you almost certainly would be saying, well, let's over-collect data for personalization. Let's try and capture more and be quite vague in where that retention is. I always say it doesn't matter what the tool within the digital space, and that can include when it's personal and security, your CCTV system data and more. That concept within a data protections impact assessment of what data is stored, where's it stored, who has access to it, and for how long. That multiplier of the 4 gives you your risk index of what's the likelihood of that happening and what would be the impact if it did. And the same applies when it comes to collection of data and AI. And then I suppose the other thing is there is a pathway sometimes to try and normalize what's referred to sometimes as closed systems. In other words, there are tools we use, but there just aren't any visible audit trails, no kind of reference points, no explainability as to how that information is used and how results are generated. So we end up in a little bit of a, that silent mode of we kind of saying, yes, I think it's working, but we don't really have that much loop into it. And not surprisingly for me, then the opposite of weaponizing AI is the flip, which is about those questions about transparency. Where are the data sets? How's it stored? Where are your guardrails? What do you have visibility and access over of? And more often than not, it does come down to that visibility.
There's a couple of things in there I'm just going to ask you to explain for us, just in case, because teachers probably hear these terms and maybe aren't really clear on what we mean by that. And the first one is guardrails. So when we talk about guardrails and we're attaching it to obviously safety, what do we mean by that?
Well, normally they appear when I'm invited to go 10-pin bowling and they recognise my lack of talent, but a slightly different context here. So in the sense of guardrails, look, we're within education space, we're always very mindful of safeguarding anything. And guardrails really are, where do we want to put the boundaries, the limits on what this tool uses or has access to or can share. And so often within AI tools, guardrails are either limiting and restricting the data set, the pool of information that the tool is able to respond to, or it's limiting the topics by which the tool is able to respond to. And then I suppose the last part of that is that visibility part is, if you're an Office 365 tenancy school or a Google tenancy school, you will have access to Copilot or Gemini, and you'll have central controls that will limit whether the data you're using within the tool is being shared as part of its larger language model, or whether you have visibility of what questions and resources are being accessed by staff and potentially students. So guardrails are always those things about how do we have not just a procedure that says we're trying to keep our children and learners and their data safe, but actually a way of evidencing that we have the steps and activities to do that too.
Amazing. Now, we're obviously having this framework about governance and helping educators, leaders, schools around the world. We want to provide them with some information today. And I'm in this one, and I think there's lots of schools, especially on this side of the world, that we hear this, but aren't really sure where to start. So from your side, what would be the non-negotiables that schools should look to be bringing and doing when it comes to things like ethical AI governance?
Well, let's just start with a little bit around the kind of what we mean by governance and what that really looks like, because there is a different discussions around it. In the same way as our systems within running our schools require us to do reporting and finance, the governance doesn't tell us that we have to figure out what system and tool to use. So governance at the highest level is just having systems, standards and structures in place that allow us to control and oversee the activities, with an end game of quality, performance and accountability. So how do we have a grip on our system? Now, I kind of put a structure in place, and there are some non-negotiables I cover, but I think for the context of our conversation, if you'll humour me very quickly, 8 bullet points that make up a government framework, that rinse and repeat that you might want to consider in your school. Set the scene. What's the purpose of why you're having this conversation? Identify your foundations. What are you actually looking for? Check your digital strategy, your cultural readiness, if you're talking along those lines. What are your school priorities so that you can align AI with the school development plan, the areas that you want to impact on when it comes to teaching and learning, or it might be other school priorities, recruitment and retention, reducing workload. Where are the opportunities and risks that AI offers? What are your policy tenants? How are you going to control where it can be used and when it's not? How do you test and evaluate something? How do you create a listen and learn culture, human in the loop, feedback loop? And then how do you, as the final part, scale that strategy year on year? Now, all the questions when it comes to governance in my frame, I think sit somewhere along that path, because we all need to have something that's a bit more accessible as okay, I've got 8 steps here we can work through. It prompts us to ask the right questions, and then we can get into the detail. So when it gets down to what's the non-negotiables, Alex, I suppose the first thing is actually the non-negotiable is you have to start with a purpose. You have to define a why. Why are we using these tools? What problem are we trying to mitigate? And how do we intend to use it? We might then come on wearing our governance hats to also how do we intend to measure it? And that might differentiate us from the traditional measurements in schools, which typically ends up being student outcomes. Then we might say that the non-negotiable is we need to have a broad church. No one person is an expert. It's a moving feast. AI is interwoven into both the impact on staff workload because of the balance between opportunity and risk. So we should really be talking about having some cross-represented digital committee, some kind of reference group within our organisation to make sure we co-produce. We should always have with our digital tools, and AI just amplifies it, something many of us have talked about for many years, a test before you trust mindset. That's a non-negotiable, so that you have this cadence where you're always having the right evaluation. You're looking for what your measures are, and there's all different ways that we can garner evidence when we're looking at testing products, whether it's that kind of correlational evidence, the causal evidence, and so on. Data protection by design, which is probably a bigger one, but minimisation, data retention rules, opt-out rules, visibility of the tools we're using are non-negotiable. And my last one, because we have a habit when we're under pressure of doing stuff and then moving on to the next thing that's top of the list, is that we have to build in the continuous review. We can't make it a one-time exercise. There has to be that cadence and that continual cycle of reviewing what we're doing. And if you bake those into talking about AI, which happens to be the big buzz right now, I think what it will do is it will also give you a reflection point on the other digital tools that you have that potentially don't have the impact that you thought they had, or maybe are, and you haven't realized and you've not had the opportunity to scale those more purposefully.
Obviously, there's going to be educators listening to this, and you'll have seen this in the schools, numerous schools that you work with. How do we ensure then that those steps that you've talked about, this policy and framework, for want of a better word, isn't just something that ends up being written onto a document and laminated around classrooms? How can schools ensure that this becomes actually something that's trusted, that it's implemented, it's actioned, and that there is clear oversight to it?
Well, let's start with one which is probably a counter position. I quite like the idea of a laminated document, because what I keep seeing working with multi-academy trusts and school districts and other systems over the last year is people with a big smile saying, good news, Al, we've got our data protection, but we've got our new AI policy, and they wheel it in on a cart. And I always ask the question, are you expecting staff to remember all the tenets of your AI policy when they log onto their computer in the morning? Actually, you need to distill down as a starting point into much clearer structures that sit on a reminder to staff of actually what we're trying to build around those kind of core bits, that acceptable use. We've got a set of approved tools, compliance and safety, transparent risk, and so on. So I would kind of flip the other way, just to be contrary for the benefit of our conversation. So to stop my policy being something that's just sat in the bin, or the school have got a big AI policy, I'll be saying take the clear elements of what tools do you approve right now? How do you approve the use of AI tools? So you might say you can use these AI tools, you can't upload personalized data, and anything more than 2-3 sentences generated you need to cite so that we can see in our history of our lesson plans or resources. Make sure that we have those baked in as something that allows staff to have confidence trying and developing, but with those guardrails of what tools have already been approved, which tools are available to us. Schedule quarterly reviews, have the clear owners and metrics on what's happening. That takes your AI policy and always keeps it current, publish, find ways to measure impact reports to your broader teaching community and governors, that transparency on AI. So when I talk to folks and we talk about digital, and I think sometimes AI gets singled out, but let's think of it as part of our bigger digital. We often say the big conversation is how do we measure impact? And we get drawn to, well, it's something to do with attainment and progress, because those are the things that we can wrap around our learners. But if we look at our risk register right now, we'd say actually the biggest challenges we've got are better use of our data. We've got, depending on the type of school we are around the world, we'll have conversations about attendance and appropriateness. So it's about tools that make our curriculum more relevant. We would absolutely have a big conversation about teacher recruitment and retention and workload. And so we might say that actually what we're trying to do here is we're trying to free up the human to do more human-to-human things in our teaching and learning environment. And so our measures of impact are going to be more about reducing workload or speeding up the feedback loop or providing that personalised learning tool that sits alongside the teaching journey. And so I think we redefine some of our measures. And then the one that probably, I mean, your podcast is a fab example of that, is continuous professional development is not something that you have for 2 or 3 hours on inset at the start of the academic year, and then that's it. And for a few years now, I've used the rather clumsy analogy of saying Manchester United don't just train on the first day of the season and then that's it till the cup final. And then after last season, most people have assumed that's exactly what they did, but that's a whole different story. But there's a point to this, isn't there? Which is what we tend to do with any new technology or any new digital is we give a sniff and a taster to staff, and then the assumption is you'll figure the rest out in your own personal time using your own personal pathways to professional development. And then we wonder why we don't have confidence either using the tools effectively or, more importantly, have confidence in how we can guide our learners where it is and isn't appropriate to use it.
So how do we overcome that? Because I've just written down, I'm noting down things as you talk, and I've put CPD, as you mentioned it, and educators are going to go, let's say, I'm time poor, or my school's not doing this. How do we overcome that? Because it's a challenge as old as time almost, isn't it, with this? What are you seeing as some of the things that would work, and what advice would you be giving?
So I think the first thing we have to recognise is, there needs to be the starting point, which is the empathy of the teacher's cup of things to do is full. And there's a natural thing, which is where possible as leadership, you've got to tip something out first before you add something else in. In the case of AI literacy, I think it highlights a number of strands. The first thing is this is something potentially that is a skill to learn that might reduce workload or save you time when used purposefully. It might be a skill to learn to give you the confidence to decide when to, and more importantly, when not to use tools like AI in your classroom. But that's about empowering the teacher to use their professional judgment. There is a second thing, which this moves on to a bigger conversation, which is whether we like it or not, the workplace has now decided that these are technologies and tools, particularly some of the latest AI tools that are a feature of the workplace. So we need to make sure that our children leave school with the appropriate skills and confidence to use them safely. So we don't get a choice. We're going to have to tackle this. So when we look for staff and we say, how do we do it? Well, the first most obvious one, Alex, I think probably on average, I go to 1 or 2 trusts a week in my current role working with school leadership. And I would use a particular example, which is, can you signpost me the scientists or the linguists? And they would say, well, it's Alex and it's Fred and it's Sarah or whatever. And I'd say, okay, can you tell me who are the experts on OneNote or on, in the terms of current things, Copilot or whatever the tool might be. And there tends to be a tumbleweed moment. And so the first thing I say is before you start looking at introducing tools and developing that as part of professional development, you need to signpost the flag bearers. Who are the other peers, the staff in the school that have confidence with those tools? That means when others want to play with it, they've got someone they can reach out to. The second thing is, we're very good at thinking from an educational perspective of how we provide, good exemplars, and we make sure that it's time focused for learners to engage. And then when it comes to teaching staff, we kind of say, well, there's a 4-hour video to watch, or you can all sit through some PowerPoint at death. And we apply none of the same logic as was done to our learners. So I would say, with those experts, start building those 10, 15-minute exemplars on the how to use these tools. Look at your system, whether you're Google or Microsoft, to provide a place and space where you can share the wins and the and also the losses where you've tried tools that do work well, and what a good one looks like. A WAGOLL always beneficial to everybody, and also the ones where don't waste your time, it really didn't work for me. And at the end, the other part, I guess, is signposting. Where are the easy places you can go to try, build confidence, and get a sense of where these things are? But the school will be richer for it, because then you start more conversations, as many school leaders are now, which is, well, we can't push back against this tide, but we can absolutely hold the flag in the sand that says, look, we're going to do this at our pace, safely and securely with our learners. But it also gives us an opportunity and a reason to revisit what assessment looks like in our school, revisit the way that we actually want to capture student learning, and we want to revisit how the balance between the work that's done in school and out of school plays out with the advent of these tools readily available. And that's a healthy conversation that sadly governments are typically around the world particularly bold to take forward, other than to put the onus straight back on schools.
You mentioned skills in there, and obviously I'm a big advocate of skills, and even come from a sports background. Like mine's rugby. I love like talking about rugby and trying to apply skills. Who do you think should be deciding the AI skills that students leave with? Because at the moment we hear this like workplace, and loads of people talk about the workplace jobs and you've got all these different people with different agencies saying we need these skills, and we use the general term AI literacy, don't we? But in reality, there's two questions here. What do you think are the fundamental skills students should leave with? And secondly, who should actually be determining what are good skills we should keep or skills they don't really need?
Well, not a plug, but I did write a book recently where a number of the chapters were around the awkward questions in education, and that included skills as one of the chapters, the role of AI and what that looks like for teaching and learning, and frankly, just what is a good school, because we have a different perspective on that. So when it comes to what do we need for skills, well, there is a workplace bit. Sometimes we have a bit of a tension, don't we? Our education system has largely been baked into a model that's not changed much in 150 years in the broadest sense, and we have some mindset, and forgive me for 2 seconds on a slight tangent, but I think it kind of sets a bit of a tone of where I get really passionate. We have a mindset in the West that the most academic, the smartest kids will be most successful in life. There's me generalizing for effect. And in the same context, often in the East, there's a mindset of the child that works hardest, the extra practice, the extra effort they put in will lead to ultimate success. And I share a Chinese proverb of a stumbling bird will reach the forest first, which is linked around that mindset of it's about not who's quickest, it's about put the effort in. And then along comes AI as this disruptor that says no matter how smart you are, Alex, you're never going to be better than AI at mathematics. You're never going to be a better linguist than a technology and large language model that can output in 60 different languages in seconds. And employers go, yeah, you know what we need is we need the most humanist skills. We need those skills that are those soft skills that are now those power skills. We want the people with critical thinking, with creativity, with imagination, with good communication skills, with resilience, all those bits. And then in parallel, a project I co-chaired, working with the Fed and the OECD, was looking at our move from our pure PISA rankings to the OECD system for measuring what they promote as an education system for human flourishing, where we can actually look and capture the sense of, is the best school a child that leaves at 17 saying, I've got my qualifications, but never again am I picking up a book and reading something that was torture. I've sat in rows and done nothing else. Or is the best school one where a child leaves as a rounded individual with a passion and a love for learning? Or, as I would distill that all down, baked in curiosity. And if the answer is we really value that school that is the whole child, the breadth of skills, those most human traits, then our education system often is measuring the wrong things. So when we come full circle and say, well, business and the workplace wants the most humanist qualities, and we know technology is only going to advance. We can follow Moore's law. Every year it's going to get twice as fast for half the size and continue to evolve. And then what we have to look at from skills are those things that the employers want. Wherever we are in the world, whether we're in the UAE or whether we're in the UK, there will be every quarter quarter, every year, LMI, labour market information published by businesses that will show where there's a shortfall of skills versus jobs and availability. And if we're sitting in countries that say we've got a 2030, a 2040, a 2050 ambition for growth, typically linked around multipliers for GVA, gross value add, and we have the same in Cambridge, the research centre of the world, an expectation of growth, they start with a shopping list of who they can't recruit and how education needs to prime the pump with the skills that people want. And so that shapes us thinking within the limited confines of what we can do in education, because we can't just say, well, we'll throw the whole curriculum out and do something else, albeit I might argue 10 years from now, micro-credentials and other things will be a lot more dominant. But what we can do is say the things that will most empower our learners right now is to broaden skills. And if we want to co-produce skills, we can't assume that in education we've got all the answers. We should involve parents. We should absolutely involve young people, because part of that conversation will hopefully mitigate the gap on attendance of seeing relevance in what they're being taught. And perhaps not a surprise why we see more problem-based and project-based learning, because children often invest and engage much more so in that. Absolutely, we should look to business where we are, that locale of what's relevant to us, I think feeds into where we sit on the skills gap. And then hopefully nationally, we also have louder voices saying, how do we consolidate that into broadening the curriculum offer? Something which most places in the world, recent years, the curriculum offer has been a narrowing journey down to those core strands that we would have measured back in the late 1800s, diplomatically.
Yeah, and you mentioned voice there. Who do you think should get a voice? And I know you kind of touched on it a little bit earlier, the stakeholders that we have, but what you've mentioned there affects everyone. Who should have a seat at the table?
I mean, I often share a Venn diagram on co-production, and I suppose I could argue, well, look, if I share that Venn diagram, I'm making sure that nobody feels left out. But whenever we're talking about curriculum, the role of technology, things we can do, I absolutely believe that at the heart of it is always going to be staff and students, and agent stage also parents. And the more we involve stakeholders, we can be quite realistic and transparent and say it's much harder to pull through, and not everybody's looking at these things from the same levels, and so we have to be measured about it. But I think it is staff, student, parents, community, and then other links into where our curriculum, where what we're offering, the skills breadth we're doing is most purposeful. And now the world is a-changing. 10, 15 years ago, I'd be visiting a school in Sunderland in the northeast of England, and the only opportunity for people leaving that school was the large Nissan factory up the road. And so not surprisingly, children were shaped with the skills that were needed for the future workplace to make sure they could go get jobs. Now that same child can apply for a job from their bedroom and be working in Silicon Valley. And so the locale has changed somewhat, but I do believe that if we want to think about a future education system, that element of relevance to our learners is something we can only acquire by talking to our learners, talking to business, and therefore looking at the skills and the courses we offer and saying these are relevant because these unlock these pathways, these choices for your career that give you agency.
So thinking about that, let's set the scenario then and bringing it back to AI and governance a little bit in schools. Do you think it's possible then for a 15-year-old to hold an AI provider accountable?
It's difficult, isn't it? There's a yes in there, but it is difficult because the idea of holding accountability at any age and stage with some technology is really difficult. So I would say the first thing is if you're a 15-year-old and you want to provide a hold accountability when it comes to technology, particularly platforms, the first thing is there's always going to be a case of you've got to include others. You've got to include teachers, parents, governors potentially into some kind of grouping on that. You've got to make sure that you've got a clear voice on how that's being articulated. You've got to have transparency. Maybe within organizations, within countries, we talk about students' digital bill of rights, which are different ways of providing that mechanism for a child to hold a provider to account. It does come down to having the right mechanisms, both in terms of vendor transparency and that core, which is we have our own legal rights from a data protection perspective on terms of what happens to our data and where it's used. I choose to be a little bit pawsy because the truth is the legislation is intended in most countries to provide an individual to have the ability to hold a provider to write on their data. But the actual pathways are such that that accessibility, I think, is almost held out as an attempt to reassure, when in truth, I'm not sure the reassurance is actually functionally that practical in most cases.
And we've seen lots of, I say, negative scenarios in terms of the impact of these vendors on students around the world, haven't we? I think recently with interactions with AI and what it's led to among youngsters. How do we mitigate? Yeah, how do we go about mitigating that then? Because we're talking then about student. I think my side I'm thinking here is that for a student to hold an AI accountable or a vendor accountable, they have to have a level of knowledge about what it's doing or not doing and the impact it's having on them. And you've mentioned there both ways in schools and teachers. How do we go about this? What could we do?
I mean, there are lots of different tools and ways that you can protect young people, but the fundamental will always come down, in my eyes, to good digital citizenship. We have to educate young people to understand what they're experiencing, the bias, the data, the unseen harms, the things that exist within these tools, and provide them with the skills to not just have the knowledge, but the skills and competency, that agency bit, to actually understand the risks and harms. That starts often at primary age now in terms of that digital journey. I, for my sins, for the last 5-6 years, chair the SEND group for our region as well, that junction between health, between social care and between education, and see the frictions and tensions now that some of the social platforms that absolutely don't seem to have a clear moral compass, that don't seem to have the clarity that allows parents to have that reassurance, let alone educators, of what's happening. So I think the reality is, whilst we can't sit here and say, don't worry, there's always a form you can fill in to request something being removed or something taken down. Or if you're lucky and, let's take an open door policy, and that's your get out of jail card to protect your child at all times when they're accessing digital tech. The reality is no. The answer is we have to actually allow children to be the leaders, the digital champions in our schools. We need to educate them on the risks and the understanding about what bias looks like, how their data has an extended footprint that will be for many years longer than they think. One of the most important ones at the moment is a conversation around how we change our behaviour when we're online that gets flagged under the term digital disinhibition. The way that having an argument, you and I might speak quite differently on a WhatsApp message or a Facebook group than we would do face-to-face in a room, how we lose those kind of courtesies. But I think the biggest one is we talk about AI, and naturally everyone's saying, well, I'm really concerned about bias and algorithmic outcomes and children not being understanding the risk of it. And we do need to remember this isn't exactly new. We've all had our children going home and using Google or other search engines. Back in my day, Lycos, Alta Vista, Ask Jeeves, all good brands. And nobody sat down and got too carried away with saying, you do know when you search for a topic, the answer at the top of the list that comes back isn't necessarily the best answer. It might be that it's been shaped by who paid the most or who's got the most followers or a whole heap of other algorithms that sit around this. And that's not me trying to push this back as, so don't worry about it, it's always been there. What it is to not be intimidated by the fact that actually the more we understand, the more we play with these tools, the better equipped we are to challenge. I can talk from your region. I'm going to be next month at the Learn conference in Riyadh. And one of the conversations I had a year ago was talking about Arabic representing something like 8% of the world's population, but only 3% of the content on the internet. Forgive me if my percentages were slightly out from what was quoted with me. But there's also an element which is there's an inherent bias of underrepresentation, culturally, diversity in terms of output based on how much information is or isn't there. And we have a friction here, don't we? We have a message in our schools that says we don't want any of our information being uploaded to these large language models. We want to keep our data safe. And then the second response is, I don't like this tool. It's not representative of us. Well, yeah, that's because nobody wants to give it its data, and the large language model then trains on its own training data and it amplifies it. So one thing I push back on is saying, actually, how about project-based learning where we can understand about bias and risk, but we can do it in a positive way. In the UK, the Mapamundi project is looking at women who've invented and discovered things around the world for the last 200 years where they weren't recorded as against them as individuals, and they're now creating digital records to represent it. And in the same way, we've got projects for learners where it's about adding resources that are culturally representative of their area. So I think we learn by using, not by sticking head in the sand or saying don't let anybody turn that on or use it within our schools.
So what you've said there, I completely agree with. I want to challenge it a little bit regarding, or at least explore it a little bit regarding bias. And one thing, because there's a challenge there, isn't there? In that, on one hand, we want people to use it, we want them to go through this, but on the other hand, I think actually people hear the word bias. If they're circling around AI, whatever their platform of learning is from, you're hearing this word bias. I'm seeing these different things on it, but I'm not quite sure what it means. I'm not really too bothered about it. How do we mitigate those things of we want you to use it, we want you to play around with it, we want you to challenge these, versus also being really aware of the biases we bring in ourselves and the biases we're likely to get back?
I mean, there's a challenge at times because some of that bias we might apply is something that we're not conscious of, that unconscious bias that means that we're not always effective. I do always try, and I don't always claim to be fully successful, to try to look and discuss the topics at a more accessible level, because I think even the conversation of bias can be one that for many is like, I'm just not going to go there, I'm going to say the wrong thing, I don't understand it, where do I go? And then you get really good folks. I know Victoria Headland is somebody that you've spoken to, and you take a different view, which is, okay, I want you to provide me back from your large language model as a picture of, in my case, England's best 11 ever footballers. And surprise, surprise, they all come back as men. And yet in the last 20 years, all the trophies won by England footballers have been women. Yeah. And we start to put it in an accessible way that young people can understand. How is that? Why has it come that way? Why is it when we search for doctors, there's a heavy weighting towards men, and nurses a heavy weighting towards women, when it doesn't actually work out that way when you look at the current workforce in America at medical? Now, those are very simplistic, but it starts to question that bit of, well, where does bias come from? Bias either comes from the data sets are weighted one way. There's an algorithmic weighting that says, perhaps like my example of saying in the West, the smartest will always be most successful. There are algorithms that say people from this socioeconomic background will be less successful. There are all these different bits, but the problem is we can't challenge those if we don't know. In the same way as a teacher that says, I don't see the point of AI, I don't need it in my lessons, not going to waste my time on it. My argument is, but you need to play and understand and develop confidence with it so that you can explain why it's not relevant. And more importantly, you can support your learners who think it is and reassure them why it isn't. Our confidence comes from understanding and by challenging it. So there are weightings that make us say everything that we produce with AI tools, we could probably start safely, Alex, by saying it's a draft, it's a first iteration. Actually, one of the skills is often the iterative process, but more importantly, it is always one that we can then apply a human perspective on. Increasingly, we're kind of seeing that flip around when it comes to that moving more to the sort of formative assessment of actually, well, you've produced something using an AI tool, now take your human decision as to why it's gone that route and how you could improve it, how you could diversify on that output, and so on. But we always come full circle down to, when it comes down to bias, we have to look and say there are a number of factors here. You as a young person, as staff, need to understand what that relates to, what the different levers are that could affect that. Often it's starts with the data sets and the representation of that data set, followed by the algorithmic weighting that gets put on it.
Amazing. Yeah. Thank you for clearing that up for us as well, because there's some really good parts there. Shifting tack then, obviously we've talked about lots of different things, and what I want to do now is I want to think about what can schools do tomorrow. So for people, leaders, educators, people who are interested in this from around the world that are listening at the moment, if they wanted to start something, I'd say, what would be, let's say, a 3-step approach that they could start, maybe even this term, Monday, just something simple to get them moving forward with this?
Well, we can give it an AI badge, but let's just think it's a digital project. I would say your starter for 10 might be define a couple of measurable problems from your school development plan that you actually are trying to mitigate with the use of the tool in question. So it might be trying to reduce differentiation or something that you want to do. And then your next step would be set a timeline where you're going to pilot one or two tools and you're going to set some clear success criteria, whether it's about consistency, whether it's about equity engagement, whether it's just checking off that it's starting to be utilized in a way that aligns with our expectations. And then number 3 is set those checkpoints where you close the loop, student, staff, and parent feedback, and that you have a commitment that when you run through that process, you will then publish, scale, tweak, that rinse and repeat that I talk about. So rather than saying AI needs to be a full school project that involves all staff and it's huge, you can take it in a small scale by just defining that. What are we trying to achieve? That problem you're trying to hit, the timeline of how we're going to do it without it being a sword of Damocles, and being realistic about what our measures of impact might be. And again, the more we bring voices back to the table, the more we can rinse, repeat, and signpost it. Parents, I think, number 1 will be transparency, communication. They're in the loop. We're using these tools. This is the intended use of them. This is how we're going to make sure we're using them safely, and we'll keep you in the feedback loop as to how that gets used. And if we're lucky, we can bring them into the conversation later so they can be advocates and support our home as well.
So let's keep this idea of looking into the future. Obviously, throughout probably the last, I'm going to say 12 months, maybe 15 months, we've seen different jobs appearing. We've seen sort of like AI leads appearing on jobs. As you mentioned, Victoria was talking about then do we need bias leads, so people in schools who are focusing on those areas. And we've got different frameworks starting to appear from a global perspective, whatever the country or the government is that oversees it. And they're changing because obviously the technology we have in education is changing. Do you think, let's say in the next 4 or 5 years, we're going to see AI governance as maybe a core strand in some inspection frameworks?
I think it almost certainly will. The longevity of that is probably more in doubt. And I say that because at the moment AI is being talked about as a singular strand. But actually, I think we will find in the longer term that the AI conversation will highlight more the focus and need on developing and changing more of our curriculum offer because of what it's highlighted as a default. But I do think in the short term, we absolutely should expect to be having an inspection where we're actually being challenged on the purpose, the risk control, and the impact evidence of using AI tools. We're starting to see that in the UK already in terms of inspection teams to ask, what are you doing with these tools and how are you building confidence? I would expect us to always be able to keep evidence so we can not quite show our workings, but where are our pilots, the data protection impact assessments, the reports that we're doing for it. The bigger one will be how are we actually sharing, publishing it, and weaving it into curriculum, and where we can kind of signpost that. We're built and have been for many years. Maybe the pandemic was one of the few positives, a way of really highlighting the need for evidence-informed educational technology. And let's be honest, most of the AI we're talking about at the moment falls under the educational technology ban, but it's not necessarily developed by educational technology companies with a particular core tenant built around that. So I'm expecting, I would hope that frameworks will not just be a test, but will also be a feedback to bring back what's happening on a broader national scale, what is and isn't working. I think there'll be a need for us to develop some common language and some current guidance around AI. We're seeing that already. We're seeing some really good stuff, but I hope that will be a pushback to digital providers who want access to core markets in terms of student rights, human oversight, explainability, the equity of their systems, and so on. And then I think the bigger one we're seeing is it's a scary word, data, isn't it? Or what's in that pot? But, we had our data on a hard disk, and then we kind of had our data on our network, on our wide area network, and then we kind of got data pools, and we're now moving to data lakes. And we've kind of figured in a way the scary stuff of data, which on one hand, we have loads of it and we don't use most of it very purposefully when it comes to, real-time impact in our schools. But actually in the context of algorithmic analysis, bigger data pools provide better, more accurate feedback than small ones that tend to amplify the outliers, we will look at ways of hopefully not identifiable, but that non-identifiable data being shared more broadly between educational institutions and governments to make sure that we actually get more education-specific baselines, data, and subsequently tools. And I think if I was talking to you again in 5-10 years from now, I think most of the tools that we would be using with AI, and let's be honest, many already have it snuck in there for creating some images or some sort of lightweight bits, but most of the tools will be education-specific guardrailed tools with data sets that are much more refined to be relevant and appropriate for education. And maybe our best intentioned large platform providers of our Microsofts, Googles and co will be back more focused on personal and business use. Please.
And you mentioned in there about sharing, and obviously I think that's paramount. We talk about it takes a village to raise a child, and often or not we can sometimes see a lockdown from schools and an unwillingness to maybe share. Like, how can schools start to share work across borders and be international so that there is an improvement in this?
I'm seeing some. For those listening, obviously my reference point predominantly is UK multi-academy trust school districts in the US. But a few years ago, there would be, frankly, isolationists. We're quite competitive. We're our own organisation. Our data is our data. And for all the right reasons, we keep it locked down and secure and safe. First step would be really brave, and we'll take it from that server room and put it in the cloud. And now the conversation is different multi-academy trusts, different entities, each with a cluster of 40, 50, 60 schools, saying if we come together on projects and we share anonymized data, we'd get much more accurate outliers, we'd get much more predictions. And at the same time, we're seeing already frameworks that allow schools to track in advance of exam season where we're looking on data and tracking, because organisations like Pixel have already got, a large slice of UK schools all putting their data in there. So we get much more accurate baselines when we're looking at, our crazy system where only 60% of children are allowed to pass because that's the line in the sand that's been put there. So in the same way, we're recognising that if we want to use these tools purposefully, there are opportunities that don't need to breach any data protection if we anonymise data where institutions can work more closely together to get better anonymized data. And I think in the UAE, you've got some really, really big school system providers that, if there was the will and the intent, could create much broader frameworks, could work with government to share data, and could provide local national data that may be more relevant and more dialed in on what cohorts want. Now, there is a risk for these things, which is, do we all want to have our own country data and sit with our boundaries, or do we actually want to recognise that the world's a bit more fluid and hybrid than that? I think what it's about, Alex, is about us taking back control of the data and not leaving it in the pool of the main data providers that sit there currently. And I think, that context and relevance of the data is one that we can't have unless we put it very much within the educational context.
Completely agree. And you mentioned some things there, so I'm probably put you on the spot this, but I'm curious from your side, who's doing it right? And you could name a school, you could name a leader, even a country. Who have you seen that's getting this right?
Oh, well, there are some. There's certainly, if I look at countries, I'm going to probably go down under and talk about the Aussies. That was my attempt at an Australian accent for those listening in. It wasn't very successful, but I tried. It's early in the morning for me. But I think there's been quite a lot happening in terms of policy movement at a quicker pace in Australia. I love the work that Leon Furs, Mike Perkins and others have been doing on the AI assessment guide. I think there's some really proactive thinking about creating frameworks to think, where do I fit this and where don't I? And actually empowering us to say there isn't a place in the space at this point. Typically, governments are reactive. So it's when we've got an issue and the cat's out the bag, we then think of a way to block up the hole. And that tends to mean that we end up always being restrictive on technology rather than innovative, thinking the other way around. There are some good examples in the UK. So I can think of United Learning, Greenwood and other trusts have come together. They've got some really good data lakes now where they're getting much more refined data and in broader, not specifically AI, but broader digital assessment across their schools. There's some really good practitioners around the world talking more accurately about AI in a balanced and measured way, and there's good folks you've interviewed and people that we have common interest in, like Dan Fitzpatrick and others that I've got a lot of time for. I think the most important thing is it's okay to challenge. I think we often feel that there's been a loop, hasn't there? ChatGPT came out, and about 6 months later, we were told it was the panacea to everything. AI would take over the world and everybody would be out of any traditional job and we'd just use this tool to do everything. And then we got to a bit of a trough of disillusionment and we figured actually it's not quite what it said and the answers aren't quite what I was hoping for. And, hang on a second, I wouldn't want my child left alone on there for very long. And we're now coming back up to what gets referred to as, these are grand terms, the slope of enlightenment, where we're now saying, okay, these tools have got a place, but boy, do we need to keep an eye on them. And boy, do we need to make sure they're used purposefully at the right time. And boy, do we need to keep our learners away from these tools because they have no purpose. They avoid our children's thinking. And more importantly, the more they use them, the more those guardrails seem to diminish. And so we're back into the set the purpose. And I think that slope we're at now means that we're open to saying, I want to learn about this tool. I want to learn about these updates that are coming out, but I want to do so that I'm more effective in my questioning and challenge of it as much as I am about whether it's got a use. And if we keep the mindset in education that if we have an issue, we go look for a tool, not if we find a tool, we'll go find a problem to use it on, then I think we'll do ourselves proud.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. Thank you for that. Starting to wrap this up then, I'm curious from your side, if you were to name your AI policy in 3 words, what would they be?
Review and renew, which is replacing the idea of set and forget, which is it's a constant document. It's not something you do once and say, hallelujah, we've got it in the bag.
I've never written so many kind of 3-letter acronyms or like phrases that link down. I've got all my notes from our conversation here, Al, and I've just got place and space. I've got review and renew. I've got all sorts of different things written down. Have you got like just a library of these that you've established over years?
I'm just getting old, I think is the answer.
Easy way to remember things. Just keep it short and simple. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure, Al. I really appreciate it. You said it's early for where you are. It is early just for those people listening for Alice. So we appreciate him getting up and taking the time to speak to us and share what is, I think, a really vital cog, because it's one part, and I think hopefully you'd agree, it's one part of education that when done well has a huge impact. And there's other parts to come into it, but this is a really significant part of this moment in time and the fork in the road, as it were, or the crossroads, however we phrase it, how we're moving forward.
Trying to be the critical friend, Alex. It's always just whatever good and whatever we're trying to do, it never hurts us to stop and just challenge the why.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I say this to my students. We do very fortunate within school, within running a sixth form, that I get to kind of play around with enrichment programs or general studies programs. And we always start year 12 with a learning to learn. And said this to them just this week about being able to stop and reflect on how am I doing things? Are they working? And I think for us as teachers, we get very swept up in moving forward. And I think I even posted about it yesterday in the comparison of students now are just so used to swiping and screens and digital. It's not impressive to them anymore. And yet you put a microscope with an onion and some iodine and allow them, and they're blown away from this piece of technology that's 400 years old. I think that ability to take stock and ask that question of the why, why are we using these things? What is the space? What is the place for this? And can I stop and really it's the Ferris Bueller quote, isn't it? life moves pretty fast. And I think we can sometimes be very much guilty of that. So having these conversations and providing opportunities and information and ideas for teachers to take stock and ask those questions, I think is really important. So thank you for really providing that information and the ideas to help with that. It's been a really great conversation, Al.
It's my pleasure. And keep flying the flag. I've loved watching. We're now on season 4. I've watching episodes and sharing many of them. I'm sometimes jealous of the quality of production, and that looks a lot sharper and clearer and nicer sounding than my meagre efforts. But you've had so many great guests on. So yeah, do keep doing the amazing work, Alex.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. Really appreciate it. To end with, and most people for this, if people want to find you, if they want to get involved, they want to find out more about all the wonderful things that you guys are doing, where should they be heading to?
Goodness, I suppose I do tend to lurk more on LinkedIn now. So Al Kingsley on LinkedIn. I am on X, but I'm losing faith at a pace. I do try and summarize stuff. I write lots of books that are my effort to try and make things accessible. If you head over to, perhaps not surprisingly, alkingsley.com, you'll find books, contacts, lots of the articles I try and share. And on a Saturday morning, when I'm chatting with lovely folks and when I'm able to get up in good time, I do a newsletter on all the latest stuff happening when it comes to education, digitally and in AI, which is just my magpieing of amazing folks around the world doing cool stuff, and my excuse to do a few cockapoo cartoons to go with it. But do sign up and check that out, because I think the more we talk about stuff, the more we're able to challenge it as individuals.
I completely agree. Just out of curiosity, who gets recognised more now? Who are people more interested in, yourself or the dogs?
I've had a few people saying, we'd love you to come and speak at an event. Will Thurdy be able to come? And I'm thinking, you just on the pod, don't you? Let's be honest, I should probably just put him up for standalone booking. Now I have my new puppy Harris to support it, and people have questioned why Harris, but he's short for Harris Tweed, which is something I care about. But yeah, we don't want to go on too long on a lovely chat here. There's intentionality in what I do, which is when I do a presentation or my newsletter, you can either do a really technical newsletter of all the things discussing large language models and AI around the world, and people go, well, that's not really for me, that's for the techies. Or you can wrap it up with some smiling cockapoo dogs and a few jokes, and people engage with it and suddenly realize that many of these conversations they can be part of, and actually the fact they're not techies is irrelevant. They can still have an opinion, they can still learn from them. So making stuff a bit more light-hearted is my clumsy way of making things easier to learn.
Well, on this Saturday morning, Al, we very much look forward to reading, hopefully, fingers crossed, in a couple of hours, your next edition for this. So thank you again, and have a lovely weekend and enjoy the rest of 2025.
Thank you.